Okay, so we're getting ready to anchor here. I've got the anchor locker open and the snubber wrapped around the cleat. So I got 4 red marks there, 1 mark for each 10 meters. That's 40 meters out. I'm gonna start there. It was 9 meters deep to the water, to the top of the water. And we usually do at least a 4-to-1 ratio to start off. So 4 times 9 is 36, close enough to 40 with a little bit of cushion, and we'll set the anchor and see how it holds. Hi, welcome back to Life 4.0. This is Tom. Today I'm going to be talking to you about anchoring. This is a first video in a series of videos we're going to be doing about anchoring. And today I'm going to talk about the process of getting prepared and making sure that everything is set up correctly in your anchor chain and anchor line. So I'm going to talk to you about how to properly mark your anchor chain. It may sound like a trivial thing, but it's an important step. How to properly splice your nylon anchor line to your chain. And third, how to set up a snubber and how a snubber should be used. So let's dive in. Why care about marking anchors and anchor lines? It's really important to mark your anchor lines to get the right scope deployed during the anchoring process. If you don't have your anchor road marked, you're going to be left to guess as to how much you have put out, and then you don't always know if you have the right scope and whether your anchor is going to hold. Some people use counters, windlass counters. It's like a simple little sort of odometer kind of thing for counting how much anchor line has been put out. But these aren't always accurate. They need to be properly calibrated. And the other issue is that they're located typically at the helm station and not up at the bow where the person really needs to see it to know how much they've let out. We were recently anchored in the area of Cinque Terre along the northern coast of Italy, and a boat came in next to us. We were already anchored, and a boat came in next to us and anchored, and they started letting their anchor chain out, and they stopped rather sooner than I thought. We were in about 30 feet of water, and I don't think they let out more than maybe 30 or 40 feet. And they slowly, kind of drifted downwind, and then they pulled their anchor chain back up, and they re-anchored in the same spot. And this went on about 3 or 4 times. And later on I went over and I said to them, I don't think you're putting out enough scope, and it's kind of a delicate issue. You don't really want to kind of get in other people's kitchens in terms of how they're doing the process, but clearly they weren't letting enough chain out. And he said, no, he was looking at his counter at his helm. He says, no, I've let out about 120 feet. And I go, I don't think so. And you could just tell by how long the windlass was running. It was barely letting out enough chain to even get the anchor to touch bottom. And eventually he realized and looked at it and realized that his counter wasn't working correctly. So that's just an example of how you want to have a method of marking and understanding how much chain you put out that you can look at while you're deploying your chain. Okay, I want to just talk about terminology first before we get too far along. I mentioned the chain itself, so pretty much every anchor system has some amount of chain. Some people have really short lengths of chain, but most cruising boats, extended cruising boats, have a significant amount of chain, usually a couple hundred feet of chain. And then there's the line, which line is another name for a rope on a boat, and that's they're usually made out of nylon. That's makes it the balance of the anchor arrangement. And the whole thing combined together, the chain and the line, is all considered what's called rode, R-O-D-E. So that whole thing is referred to as your anchor rode. The other term that I'll mention is gypsy. This is the device on the windlass that has those little notches in it that catches each link of the chain as you're deploying your chain or recovering your chain. So that's the gypsy. And the last thing I mentioned, you heard me mention earlier, was scope. So scope is referring to the amount of anchor line that you've let out related to how deep the water is below the water line of where you're located. So if, let's say, the depth of the water is 10 feet and you've let out 50 feet of anchor line, you have a scope of 5 to 1. And this is important to know because you want to have at least a 4 to 1 ratio of anchor line out for your anchor to properly hold. And if in storm conditions, you want 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 to 1 scope for your anchor to properly work right. We sometimes anchor in 3 to 1 if we're stopped somewhere for just a quick lunch bite, and then we know that there's somebody on board who's watching carefully to make sure that we're not dragging. But I would never do that overnight. So again, 4 to 1 is important there. And this gets back to the whole purpose of the video, is that if you don't know, if your anchor line isn't marked in your way, you're left to kind of guess in terms of how much you've put out, and you have no idea if you're shooting for a 4 to 1 scope, you have no idea if you've let that proper amount out. So what are some of the options for marking your chain? Well, you can apply paint to the links of the chain to mark them. You can do zip ties. I started out by doing a combination of the two. So the first step is to lay your chain down, typically on a dock somewhere, get it out of your anchor locker. First off, get a chance to dry, and then you lay it out on the dock. And ideally you want to flake it out on the dock in one standard distance, and I would suggest a distance of 15 feet. So a loop that goes down the dock 15 feet and comes back 15 feet. And I'll tell you why that particular length is important in a minute. And then regarding paint, and I would suggest first off on the paint color you want to use red. Red is usually the easiest to identify. And you can apply it with a brush and paint it obviously to the link of the chain. Better yet, you can use some red spray paint. And when I've done this before, I've used a cardboard cutout, kind of like a cardboard stencil. First off, you don't want spray paint to be going around the rest of the dock area or on other people's boats. So you cut out a little hole in the cardboard that is just about the size of one chain link, and you can lay that right over the link you want to paint and spray it down. You will inevitably get a little bit of paint, whether you're brushing or spraying it. You'll get a little bit of paint on adjoining links, but that's just kind of the reality of how things work. You want to develop your marking pattern, meaning how far apart you want your markers to be on the chain. I use a length of 30 feet or 10 meters. So I do one mark at the 30-foot length behind the anchor with one red link marked. And at 60 feet I do 2 red link marks, and so on. I would suggest avoiding too frequent of a marking pattern, like every 10 feet or so. It may seem like it's really handy and maybe more accurate to get the right anchor line out, but it ends up being a little bit of overkill. 30 feet is a good amount. It's not too long, not too short. Say you're aiming to put out 100 feet of line, anchor line. You let the anchor line out until you got to 3 red chain link marks, and then you just go a little bit further, and you can easily estimate 10 feet when you're letting the anchor line out at that point, so you get your 100 feet right there. So again, you're marking it with red paint or a red paint brush or red spray paint. I also add a zip tie I just add one zip tie to each location of where I've marked it. This becomes handy as kind of a backup in case the red paint wears off and it's kind of hard to find. It's another way to identify the location of your mark. You don't want to make the zip tie too long. I sort of clip off just a little bit left on the zip tie, and otherwise it can get hung up on that gypsy on your windlass. And also, you don't want to use anything that's like a streaming ribbon or a streaming piece of line. These things that are too long like that can get, again, hung up in your windlass. When you use the red paint, you're going to expect that paint to wear off, wear away, and I would say you're going to want to redo that painting about every 2 years. It depends on how often you anchor and what the seafloor conditions are like where you anchor. Another option to use to mark the anchor chain is these plastic markers that snap inside an individual chain link. This is a new thing to me. I don't know how long it's been out, but I noticed it recently at a marine store, and I gave it a try this past summer when we were cruising in the Med. They're reasonable, they're cheap, they don't wear away like regular paint does, and they come in a variety of colors. I was kind of skeptical. I wasn't sure that these things would actually hold in the links. I thought they would pop out easily. But in fact, they worked quite well. We only lost one marker for a whole summer of sailing. So I use one red marker again for every 30 feet of chain. So one at the 30-foot mark, two at the 60-foot mark, etc. They're made by a company called Imtra in the United States. You can get them at Defender and other marine stores. In Europe, you can find them at Acoustic Diffusion and other, I'm sure other major marine stores will have them. So again, if you flake out your chain and your line on the dock in 50-foot long loops, you can just stay at one end of that loop and keep marking the 30-foot, the 60-foot, or the 10-meter, the 20-meter, the 30-meter points. That's the way it makes it easier to go. Doing this process also gives you a good chance to inspect your chain to make sure everything's okay and there's no suspect areas or issues with that chain. Next, you need to figure out how you're going to connect your line, your rope, to your anchor chain. Some boats, have an all-chain rode and they don't have any line. I don't see that too often though, and it adds a lot of weight to your chain locker. I would say you end up with a good compromise when you have half chain, half line. On our 44-foot boat, we have about 70 meters of 10 mil chain and 65 meters of 16 mil line. That gives us 135 meters total, which is roughly about 440 feet. So that's our primary anchor rode, and it's plenty long for us to work with. If you're anchoring in water that requires more than the length of chain you have, and you switch over to line, it actually is kind of handy because it gives you a little bit of stretch in your anchor line. That's one benefit of using just straight line is you get a nylon line. You get a nice stretch going on there, and it kind of eases everything, all the pieces in the solution. It doesn't jerk anchor out of the seafloor. It doesn't rip your cleat off your bow of your boat. So it gives a good compromise there to have that. So again, ways to connect your chain to your anchor line. You can use a shackle, and a shackle with or without a thimble. This presents a problem if it's difficult to get that combination of shackle and thimble through your windlass and through your hawse pipe in your deck. Most of the time it ends up being, your chain is about this big and your shackle is about that big in order to get around through that chain link. So it ends up being too big to go through your windlass. Another option is to actually splice the line directly to the chain, and this is my preferred approach, as you'll see in the picture here. And there's lots of links on YouTube in terms of how to actually do this splice, and I'll include that in the description of the video. But basically you're doing, and you can use either a 3-strand line, or what I was using here was an 8-plat line that you splice through. So you end up splicing it through several links in that chain to sort of ease the abrasion that might occur between the line and the metal part of the chain links. This works really well. It feeds through the windlass easily. You may end up with a little bit of extra line sticking up at the end of the splice, but that's kind of flexible and it fits through the windlass and the gypsy quite well. You still want to inspect this regularly, and I would say maybe every 5 or 7 years, maybe you'd want to redo that splice to remove any kind of abrasion from the line. So with the rest of your rode made up of line, you're going to also want to mark that line as well. You could use paint, I guess, theoretically, but the best solution is these thin plastic ribbons. They're often sold in marine stores with the pre-labeled 30-foot increments printed on them. These work great. You just simply squeeze them in between the strands, and then you pull the strands tight again on the line, and they squeeze and hold those plastic markers on. And they roll through the windlass quite well without issue. In addition to buying them in a marine store, you can actually make up your own from a piece of vinyl or a piece of extra sailcloth material. Those both work quite well. So now you've got your chain and your line marked, and you're getting ready to go here at this point. One of the advantages of having a combined chain and line setup is that if you're in deep enough water where you have to let out all of your chain and then you get over to your line acts as a kind of a natural shock absorber to the ups and downs and swings and and pitching of your boat. So you have that sort of cushion or spring effect going on there. But for everyday anchoring, typically you have more chain than you need. And in that case, you'll want to use what's called a snubber. A snubber is simply a short length of nylon dock line, a stretchy dock line, that you attach to the last part of the chain before it comes up over the bow and onto your boat. And it can be maybe a length of, say, 10 to 15 feet long. Again, it attaches to the chain and then it comes up onto a deck cleat or a Samson post, something nice and sturdy on your foredeck. Optionally, you can splice in a loop on the end that's going to attach to the boat and have that loop available to quickly wrap around a cleat. On the anchor chain end of this snubber, there's a couple different options of how you attach it. My preferred approach is to use a rolling hitch, but other people do use things like a chain hook, which is a hook that's just the right size for the chain link, and it slides over the chain link and holds that chain link solid and doesn't slide down the chain. I don't really like these approaches with a chain hook because it puts a lot of stress on that one link and on the hook, and there's a lot of torque going on there and sideways pull at a right angle. So I don't really like how it stresses the chain, especially under a lot of load. You can also use a shackle. You can shackle the snubber right onto a link on the anchor chain, but all these things take much longer than putting on a simple rolling hitch. So rolling hitch is easy. You can put it on anywhere on the chain you want, and once you understand how to tie a rolling hitch, it's super fast. So I would recommend you use that approach. So I've got a short video here of when we were using this process off the coast of Corsica and setting out our anchor and tying a rolling hitch to the anchor line as a snubber. Last step then is to put the snubber on. So use a rolling hitch to tie it around the chain. Some people use a chain hook that goes around the link and holds it. I had that for a while, but I didn't like it. It puts a lot of strain on that one link in the chain. And if there's a little bit of slack, the chain hook can just fall right off and you're left with nothing. So I'm going to use a rolling hitch. And the way I do a rolling hitch, some people have different opinions about this, but I wrap around twice on sort of the boat side, not the stern side, not the bow. And then I cross over and I just put a half hitch right there. All right, and then I tighten that up really well. If you don't tighten it up, it can slip on the chain. This may not seem like it's going to hold on the chain, but we've had huge blows, 50, 60 knots of wind, and this knot there holds really well. Rolling hitch is very valuable for a lot of purposes on a boat. We use it a lot for snubbers. So now I got the snubber attached. I'm going to let more chain out so that the snubber is taking the load instead of the windlass. And I'm adding a lot of extra chain. You can see the chain kind of hanging down there quite a bit below the knot. The purpose of that is just to make sure that the snubber's really taking the load. Sometimes the snubber will stretch out a little bit, so you want to have extra chain there to account for that, and so there's no chance that the chain will get loaded up and therefore the windlass. The whole purpose of the snubber is to take the load off the windlass. You don't want continuous pull and jerking and all that stress to the windlass. It can take, like when we were setting the anchor, it can take the strain of that. It can take the strain when you're pulling the anchor up. But for 12 hours overnight, you don't want to have the strain on the windlass. The other valuable part about a snubber is that it has a little bit of stretch to it. This is a dock line, nylon dock line, so it has a little bit of stretch, and so it can kind of give a little bit of a absorbing effect if there's a surge or waves and all that. So you don't need too much. This goes right about to the waterline. That's enough. You could put more on if you want, but then it's just more line to have to worry about. And I've got this chafe gear on here to protect. It was starting to rub, the chain was starting to rub. If the snubber was under or a different position than the chain, it was starting to rub the snubber. So I put this chain guard on here attached with zip ties. So that's the arrangement. We're all done with that. Close up the locker. Just double check that everything's okay. And we're all anchored. Okay, so now you're all set. You've got your anchor line spliced to your chain. You've got both the chain and line marked. You've got your snubber all ready to go to protect your windlass, so you're armed and dangerous. Go out there and anchor, and now you'll have the ability to make sure you put out the right proper scope, which will protect you and your boat, and it'll make you a nice friendly neighbor to other boats in the anchorage and won't make them scared that you're going to be dragging. So I hope you enjoyed this video. We always look forward to your comments, and like I said, this is the first part in several videos we're going to do in the future on anchoring.